sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. We are walking in the light of God. 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 We are walking, we are walking, we are walking in the light of God. We are walking, we are walking, we are walking in the light of God. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. We are marching in the light of God. 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 We are marching, we are marching, we are marching in the light of God. We are marching, we are marching, we are marching in the light of God. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. 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 We are singing in the light of God. 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 We are singing, we are singing, we are singing in the light of God. We are singing, we are singing, we are singing in the light of God. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos. Sia hamba kukanen kwekos.
Good afternoon. The hour has come for us to celebrate the life and the legacy of none other than Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey Douglass. We are all so privileged on today to stand and to sit on the hallowed grounds on the shores of the Tuckahoe River, where Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born 200 years ago along this significant and historical river. Literally a mile or so from this site is the birthplace of Frederick Douglass, and we have to commend the Talbot County government for the naming of this new park, the Frederick Douglass Park on the Tuckahoe. Today we have come to celebrate an internationally renowned father of civil rights, abolitionist, an orator, a writer, and a statesman. Today's dedicatory and groundbreaking ceremony for the Frederick Douglass Park on the Tuckahoe and the bicentennial commemoration of the life and legacy of Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey right here in Talbot County, Maryland, where he is known as the most significant native son of Talbot County, Maryland. I am very pleased to preside over this very historical program. I am Dale Green, a professor of architecture and historic preservation at Morgan State University, where we so proudly erected a statue to Frederick Douglass in the year 1956. And it was the first statue erected to Frederick Douglass when that took place. And I also have the pleasure of serving on the Maryland Commission of African American History and Culture, where a component of the commission is the Banneker Douglass Museum, which is the state's official museum on African American history and culture, named in honor of none other than Frederick Douglass. And then lastly, and most importantly, I have the privilege of being a part of the ancestry of Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman, who was the 7th bishop of the AME Church, born on the other side of the Tuckahoe River, just literally on the Caroline County side, and Douglass was born on this side of the river, and the Bailey family and the Wayman family intermarried in the early 1800s, thus uniting our two families. So even on today, there are members of the Wayman family joining with the Bailey family on today, and so we are very proud and excited of this rich moment in our history. We are going to continue with today's program, and we are very honored to have with us the University of Maryland's Eastern Shore Concert Choir, and we want to thank them for the songs and selections that they have rendered thus far, directed by Dr. Devon B. Rao of the University of Maryland's Eastern Shore. I'll ask now that we all rise for the singing of the national anthem led by the University of Maryland Eastern Shores Choir and the Easton High School NJROTC Color Guard for the posting of the presentation of colors.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming,
And the rocket's red glare bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave
o'er the
o'er
land
the land of the free and the home of the America?
Ladies and gentlemen, the Easton High School NJROTC Color Guard. It is now my privilege to bring before you and to introduce briefly Reverend Clarence Armstead Wayman, pastor of the Bryans United Methodist Church and the John Wesley United Methodist Church. I had just mentioned a few minutes ago that I was a descendant of Bishop Alexander Wayman, who is my seventh great-grandfather. And Reverend Clarence Wayman is my uncle. He's my mother's brother. And Reverend Clarence Wayman descends from the Wayman family, who has been united with the Bailey family since the early 1800s. And in the Wayman family has been several clergy members dating all the way back to the early 1800s, where Reverend Clarence Wayman's sixth great-grandfather was Reverend Francis Wayman, and the list goes on and on and on. So he certainly descends from a family who has been among the clergy right here along the Tuckahoe River, at least since the 1800s. And so I'm pleased to bring before you Reverend Clarence Armstead Wayman, pastor of Bryans United Methodist Church and the John Wesley United Methodist Church. Reverend Wayman.
Greetings of peace and joy and grace. Let us pray. Father God, our great Creator, we thank you for this day as we've come to celebrate the dedicating of the park, as we celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of Reverend Frederick Douglass, as we've come to assemble on this hallowed ground. We celebrate that this is a day you have made, and we will rejoice and celebrate in it. God, out of darkness you ordered, out of chaos you ordered form. And so, God, we don't understand the circumstances that brought us to this moment, but we thank you that you so ordered our steps, that you so directed our ways, that Frederick Douglass would come and be a purpose for us to join together on this day, that we will be unified in the Spirit, that we will have a singleness of purpose to continue to live out the legacy established by the orator, by the statesman, Frederick Douglass. And God, we ask now that as we dedicate this ground, that as we celebrate the legacy, that God, we will not be removed from your command of service, from your command to love one another, that we will confirm and recommit ourselves to do our best in service unto you and to help our brother and our sister. God, direct us in this program. We thank you for traveling mercy as folks have come from to and fro. We thank you, God, for the tent of meeting, that we would meet under it. And that, God, we will meet under it to agree that we can move forward to a better land with better opportunities, that we can move forward as a people. And God, remind us that as Frederick Douglass overcame challenges and as he forged his way through adverse circumstances, we too can make it if we love, if we lift up Christ, if we stick together. So, God, we thank you for your Son that was sent for our salvation. And, God, we thank you for the Christ that is our Savior. We offer this prayer in the name of the Christ, Jesus, our Lord. Amen. Amen. Amen.
We will now call to the podium President of the Talbot County Council, Jennifer L. Williams, who will render the official welcome. President Williams.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Dale. Good afternoon. And what a glorious afternoon it is. I believe the Lord is shining on us today. Warm weather, sunshine, and no rain. Thank you all for joining us today at the dedicatory and naming ceremony for the Frederick Douglass Park on the Tuckahoe. I'd like to introduce my fellow council members who are here with me today. Vice President Corey Pack, Dirk Bartlett, and Chuck Callahan. Laura Price sends her regrets. It is their support that has allowed this park to be created. This is truly a significant occasion for Talbot County as we gather to pay tribute to Frederick Douglass, Talbot County's most famous native son. It is important to recognize and celebrate the legacy left to us by Frederick Douglass. He exemplified the courage and self-determination to free himself from bondage, illiteracy, and poverty, and to become a world-renowned anti-slavery activist and supporter of social justice. It gives me great pleasure to acknowledge the descendants of Frederick Douglass who are here with us today to celebrate the creation of this park. In his honor, we thank them for making the journey, and I'd like to ask them all to stand and be recognized. Today would not be happening if it were not for the incredible contributions from many of our county departments and our department heads. I would like to recognize a few who have really stepped up above and beyond to make this a reality in a very short period of time. Cassandra Van Hooser, our Director of Economic Development and Tourism, for her foresight in championing the vision for this park, what it can be and represent as we interpret Frederick Douglass' early beginnings here in Talbot County. Sam Shogay and Ryan Snow, Cassandra's dynamic duo, for their support and contributions to this project. Preston Pepper, who's standing in the back, Director of Parks and Recreation, and his entire staff for partnering with Cassandra to make today happen and for their oversight of this park in the future. Both our Roads Department and our Sheriff's Department and our Department of Emergency Services for being here with us and for the work they've done in making today happen for us in a safe manner. I'd especially like to thank our county manager, also in the back, our assistant county manager, Jessica Morris, along with Susan Moran and Karen Roberts in their office for all their support and hard work to make this happen. Also, please join me in thanking the following who have helped make this a reality. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources and Program Open Space for the funding to purchase this property for public enjoyment. The Maryland Office of Tourism for their assistance today. And please join me in a special round of applause for the family of Mr. and Mrs. George Moore for their incredible donation of the 40-acre nature preserve to Talbot County, which will allow the public to appreciate the natural beauty of this space, much like it would have been when Frederick Douglass was born. I had the privilege of attending the Frederick Douglass Bicentennial Prayer Breakfast presented by the Frederick Douglass Honor Society last Saturday. Reverend Wayman gave a very inspired talk. He talked about how Frederick Douglass never judged anyone based on labels like race, creed, religion, the color of their skin. What he looked at was how they lived their life. Did they live a life of love? Did they live a life taking care of others? Because to him, that was the most important. He was a firm believer in the equality of all people, whether they be black, white, male, female, Native American, or recent immigrant. He also was a believer in dialogue and in making alliances across all groups. As he said, I would unite with anybody to do right and with nobody to do wrong. I saw a very good example of this Saturday night, just up the road from here, at the Queen Anne Hillsborough Volunteer Fire Company dinner. I watched as John Wingrove, the brand new constituent liaison for Congressman Andy Harris's office, walked into the room not really knowing a soul there. And I watched as Melissa Kelly, community liaison for Senator Van Hollen's office, got up, went and greeted John, started to introduce him to people, and then asked him to sit with her so he would know someone. As we all know, the congressman and the senator generally don't see eye to eye on most matters. However, Melissa could have easily ignored him and left him to flounder on his own, but she didn't. I believe that Frederick Douglass would have been very proud of Melissa for reaching out to someone, even though their philosophies might not have been the same. This is the type of working together that Frederick Douglass believed in. This is what he preached and practiced. And I think we need more of it in our country today. So thank you, Melissa, for what you did. You were a shining example. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. It's exciting to see how many people have turned out. And I also want to thank Dale Green for serving as an excellent Master of Ceremonies.
Let's thank the Talbot County government one more time. It's now and again a great honor to call upon the Douglass descendant, the matriarch of the Douglass descendants, Nettie Washington Douglass, who will recognize the descendants of Frederick Douglass. She is the co-founder and chairwoman of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, and she is the great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass. She is also a descendant of Booker T. Washington. Nettie Washington Douglass, to recognize the descendants of Frederick Douglass. Please welcome her.
Oh my goodness, you should see you from up here. What a group. I am delighted and honored to be a part of this awesome day. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. And if I may just say happy birthday to, I love to say my great-great-grandpa. I am delighted. It's been a whirlwind. I think today's Wednesday, right? It's been a whirlwind week so far. I came in from Atlanta on Sunday, and it's been nonstop. I am delighted. I've been charged with explaining to you how we are related to both Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass. But before I do that, I would like to please acknowledge, I would like to be able to acknowledge my cousins that I'm meeting for the first time. When I first spoke with Terrence Bailey last year sometime, and I'm an only child, and I love family. My family's very small. Terrence said, "Don't worry, you got 200 cousins on the Eastern Shore." And please, the Baileys and the Waymans, would you please stand up again for me so I can see you from this side? Oh, all back there. Yeah. And you see the resemblance is so strong. Thank you so much. All right, I'll be brief. I'll try. I have the honor and the privilege of joining the two families together. Of course, you know I had nothing to do with it, so I'm going to explain how it happened. I'll try to be brief, Robert. My mother, maiden name Nettie Hancock Washington, was the daughter of Booker T. Washington, Jr. My mother was born on campus at Tuskegee Institute, but she grew up in California because her mother, Mrs. Nettie Hancock Washington, everybody's named the same in my family, loved California, so she moved the family out to California. And my father was born in Washington, D.C., and I'm giving these cities where they were, because people often told me growing up, well, you know, back in those days, certain people hung out in certain circles, and that's how they met and married. But that's not the case in my family. So my father was born in D.C., and he ended up graduating from Meharry Medical College. And he was commissioned to Tuskegee, to the only black VA hospital in the country during World War II, and that was in Tuskegee. So on this particular night in August of 1941, he was taking a dinner break, and rather than eat in the hospital cafeteria, the medical staff knew that they could walk across campus and eat in the student dining hall. So this night, he's walking across campus to eat in the student dining hall, and Nettie Hancock Washington is home for a 2-week vacation from California, and she's taking a shortcut across campus, going wherever she was on her way to, and they literally collided and met that night, and they were married 3 months later. So it was love at first sight. Love at first sight. And so I've been saying all day, as I've been sharing this story for the last 3 days, it just amazes me how the timing, clearly we know that it was intended, for whatever reason, God chose these two to meet. Because if my dad had decided not to have dinner at the student dining hall, they would have never met. If my mother had been late or early or whatever, so it was meant to be. So that's how the two of them came together. And I am the product of that union, and I am an only child, but I have 3 children, adult children, and 4 grandchildren. So their legacy does continue. So that's my story. I thank you very much for letting me share it, and I look forward to hearing my son speak. Thank you.
It is again a privilege to be able to call upon one of the leaders of the Talbot County Council, the Vice President in particular, Mr. Corey Pack, who will come and deliver the statement of occasion. Vice President Corey Pack.
Thank you, Dale. And I will join President Williams in saying that Dale is doing a marvelous job. We heard him speak at the breakfast the other day, and he did a wonderful job there. So, Dale, we are delighted to call you our own as well. Thank you very much, sir. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Frederick Douglass Park on the Tuckahoe. It is an honor and privilege to be with you today as we gather together on the banks of the Tuckahoe River. We are drawn to this historic location to celebrate the life and legacy of Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey Douglass, who was born 200 years ago in a small wooden cabin just south of where we are assembled here today. For many, if not for all of you here today, you know his story. Though he was born a slave, Frederick Douglass would escape to freedom and go forward to become a well-renowned orator, a leader in the abolitionist movement, and a staunch supporter of human rights. His words are as compelling and relevant today as they were in the 1800s. Through his writings, Frederick Douglass vibrantly connects us to the horrors and torment of the enslaved people living in America in the 19th century. Yet, he pleads to each of us to rise above our circumstances and to strive to be all that God has purposed us to be. So I urge you to reach within yourself and summon the courage and the fortitude to speak out against injustice and social inequality in your lifetime. For this is both the essence of Frederick Douglass, the man, and his life. To paraphrase David Collins, the history of Frederick Douglass matters not just up to the present, but more importantly into the future. and recognizing the significance of Frederick Douglass to the history not only of Talbot County, but to our nation, the Talbot County Council has chosen to dedicate this property in his honor. We believe it is important to interpret the story of Frederick Douglass and his early years in Talbot County for our students, for our citizens, and for our visitors alike. A man's birthplace and his childhood experiences can dramatically shape his view of the world. Yet Frederick Douglass would not allow the dark clouds of slavery to dim the light of a brighter future for himself and for others like him. Here in Talbot County, in the bicentennial has ignited a renewed desire in us to understand Frederick Douglass' formative years and the mark he left on this place we call Talbot County. Frederick Douglass himself noted in his book, My Bondage, My Freedom, "It is always a fact of some importance to know where a man is born, if indeed it be important to know anything about him." So as you walk around the park today and to days to come, I hope that you will take time to appreciate the natural beauty of this amazing place. But I also, and I encourage you, to take time to acknowledge the history of the land and to reflect on the life and the legacy of Frederick Douglass. It is my sincere hope that this landscape inspires you to follow in his footsteps and to make your own mark upon this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Pack. We're going to call upon Eric Lowry, who's the president of the Frederick Douglass Honor Society, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Eric Lowry.
Good afternoon. You know, I was when I came in, I shook a lot of hands. And the one thing that someone said to me that I haven't forgotten so far since I've been here is that today is a big deal. We finally have a piece of land that we can honor Frederick Douglass. And it's a real pleasure and an honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce the keynote speaker. I met Kenneth B. Morris Jr. in September 2017 at the Tidewater Inn in Easton. And I knew right at the time that I shook his hand that this was a very pleasant and people, a man of the people. And I felt so comfortable the first time that I shook his hand that I knew that the day was going to go well. Ken was in town as our guest speaker for our annual Frederick Douglass Day. And I watched him as he walked around the area where we were having the event. And he was shaking hands and taking pictures with anyone that would ask him for a picture. And I couldn't help but imagine Kenneth taking Frederick Douglass' position on the lawn in front of the crowd and standing before us and saying, "Agitate, agitate, agitate." Mr. Morris descends from two of the most important names in American history. Now, I know all of you have heard his genealogy, but there's going to be a test, and I'm going to say it again. He is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. His mother, Nettie Washington Douglas, is the daughter of Nettie Hancock Washington, who is the granddaughter of Booker T. Washington. And Dr. Frederick Douglass III, great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. Ken's life until the year 2007 could be described as distinguished, yet decidedly disengaged from his lineage until Providence called. Ken continues his family legacy of anti-slavery and educational work as co-founder and president of the Atlanta-based nonprofit Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. His career and life path are driven by a clear focus on the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative's mission to advance freedom through knowledge and strategic action. He could not have predicted that one day he would so fully embrace and be defined by the characteristics that so closely define his famous ancestors. Please welcome Kenneth B. Morris, Jr.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. What a glorious sight to be up here and to see every chair filled on this beautiful day and the celebration and commemoration of our great ancestor and my great-great-great-grandfather, Frederick Douglass. And this is a glorious and a great day, and it's a big deal. I'd like, yes, go ahead. I'd also like to thank the Talbot County government for dedicating this land, and especially want to give a shout out to Cassandra Van Hooser. Yes. When I was here last year and met Cassandra for the first time, she was so excited to come up to me and share with me what we're doing here today. She said, I've got this great idea and this great vision, and I just want to tell you about it. And so she grabbed me and she was shaking me and she was walking me around and put me in her car, and we drove out to this space. So thank you very much from the family of Frederick Douglass. You know, in standing on this sacred ground, I have to tell you that it is incredibly emotional to think that my great ancestor was born into slavery not too far from where we're gathered right here. My mom and I and my brothers and sisters spent all of our summers just across the Bay Bridge in Highland Beach, where my great-great-grandfather Charles, who was Frederick and Anna Murray Douglass's youngest son, purchased 17 acres of land, and he saved one parcel for his father to build a retirement home. And when he asked Frederick, are there any special features that you want in the home? And he had two requests, and one was he wanted the house to face in a certain direction, and then the other request was at the top of the house, he wanted something called, what I call the tower. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life was he wanted to sit up in that tower and look back across the water, look back across the Chesapeake Bay, because on the other side, you could see this land where we are, the eastern shore of Maryland. And he never wanted to forget where he had come from. He understood that history was important. And I like to think history is important for a lot of reasons, but most importantly, because we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed. And here was a man who had suffered through 20 years of enslavement and had worked to abolish slavery and then go on to become the first African-American nominee for Vice President of the United States, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African American recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia, first African American to have a statue dedicated in his honor in Rochester, New York, and the list goes on and on and on. He never spent one day of his life in a classroom because, as we know, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. And so when they would see this man with the great big white hair toward the end of his life, the statesman, they always wanted to know, well, Frederick, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And he would respond on occasion by saying, my degree is written on my back. As I was introduced, I am the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to these American heroes, not only is it a mouthful trying to spit out all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you may be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. And it's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with all of those zeros. But many people know or knew a grandparent. Some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. Well, that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old, and she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, was Booker T. Washington's daughter, and she lived to be 95. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father. And one day I was trying to wrap my mind around the distance between the generations, and I had this thought that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand just one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country. And my ancestors both were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education, they both understood from a very young age that education was going to be their pathway to freedom, and they would have to steal their education. And for Frederick Douglass, we know the story, but I see some young people in here, so I'm going to talk about his story a little bit as a child. He was born here on the eastern shore of Maryland to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his father was his master. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 7 years old. He used to sleep head first in an old corn sack on cold winter nights with his feet hanging out, because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. And he only saw his mother a handful of times because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and spend just a few precious moments with him until he would fall asleep, and then she would walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up. But he was raised early in his life by someone that showed him some love and nurturing, and that was his grandmother. And his grandmother's job on the plantation was to raise the children until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor. And so when Frederick was around 5 or 6 years old, now of course I use that range because he didn't know when he was born. There were no birth certificates for enslaved Africans. In fact, he estimated that he was born in 1817, and it wasn't until after he passed away it was determined that it was 1818, and probably in February, and he chose February 14th as his birthday because his mother used to call him her little Valentine. And so here we are today on the 200th anniversary of the little Valentine. So his grandmother said to him when he was about 5 or 6, "We're going to go on a long journey." And that journey was a 20-mile walk to the main plantation, where she would drop him off, and he would run away to check out his surroundings to see where he was. He would turn back to look for his grandmother, and she was gone, and he would never see her again. So here is a boy who only saw his mother a few times, didn't know who his father was. His siblings were like strangers to him. He had no home, he had no family, and he had no country. But in spite of all of that, he was able to rise up and to go on to affect change in the world around him, and to positively affect change in the lives of millions of people. And we would be a very different country today if there was no Frederick Douglass. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about our work, and everything that we do at the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives is really built off the foundation of one moment in time of Frederick Douglass's life. And that was when he was chosen from among all of the slave children on the plantation here on the eastern shore of Maryland to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's brother-in-law. The importance of this move was he was leaving the plantation where he wasn't in an environment where he could read and write, and he was going to the big city in Baltimore where he would be around free black children that knew how to read and write, and he would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly, when he got there, his slave mistress Sophia had never had an enslaved person before. And she didn't know that it was illegal to teach young Frederick his ABCs. And so she begins to teach him alongside her son Tommy, who Frederick was brought there to be his playmate. Now, when his master finds out about the lessons, he gets angry. And he forbids the teaching, and he looks at Frederick and he looks at his wife Sophia, and he says, "You cannot teach an enslaved person how to read and write because it will unfit him to be a slave." Did you all hear that message? And Frederick looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. I see a lot of heads bobbing out there. And Frederick was probably bobbing along. And he said, that is going to be my key to freedom. He understood right then and there that knowledge is power. And that is a message that is as relevant today as it was all of those years ago. And so Fred begins to teach himself to read and write. And one of the ways that he went about doing that was he carried bread in his pocket, and he traded it with the children for reading lessons. In his narrative, his first autobiography, which was published in 1845, he wrote, "I was always so hungry as a slave child. I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when he would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a trough similar to what pigs would eat out of, and he, along with the other children, would crawl on their hands and knees to try to eat what food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. And so now if you think about this story of this little boy in Baltimore who wants to learn to read so badly that he's trading bread, he's trading food, he's trading something of such great importance, what does that say about the value of education today to young people? What does that say about the value of education for Frederick back then? It means he would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty. And as he goes along to unfit himself to be enslaved, as a self-taught scholar, he starts to think critically about his condition. He starts to think, because his master said, if you educate him, he'll be running away with himself. And so now he starts to ask questions like, well, why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And God, do you mean for me to be a slave for life? Because I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church and in the Word and the Bible and cherry-pick verses finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, exploit, plunder, rape, and pillage his property. He couldn't understand that. And when he began to read, one of the first books that he read was the Bible. And in the Bible, he found that God, in fact, loved him. And God didn't mean for him to be a slave for life. And so he would later talk about what he would differentiate between the slave-holding Christianity of the land and the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. And so Frederick is thinking for himself. And then finally, I'm jumping ahead in the interest of time, but he would finally have the courage to run away from slavery. And one of my favorite quotes, when he would pray to God and he would ask God for deliverance, and do you mean for me to be a slave for life? And then later he said, I prayed for 20 years, but my prayers weren't answered until I prayed with my legs. This also is a message about taking action. I mean, prayer can move a mighty mountain, but if you want a job and you don't put it in an application, so prayer and action, and that's a message for our young people too, and the work that we do. And so Frederick Douglass goes on and he becomes the leading voice of the abolitionist movement, publishing the North Star newspaper out of Rochester, New York, an advisor to presidents, particularly Abraham Lincoln, and brings us to where we are today in the present. And how does his legacy live on through his descendants? How does it live on through all of the young people out there that need hope and need inspiration? We do a lot of work in schools, and over the past 10 years since Robert Benz and I'd like Robert to stand up. Robert is the co-founder of our organization. And we've been friends for more than 20 years. And so when we talk to young people, our young people do not know where they come from. But it's not their fault. I understand for those of us that descend from slaves, why stories were not passed down. In 1865, when the last of 4 million enslaved Africans were freed, there was no plan for emancipation. There was no counseling. There was no post-traumatic stress disorder designation. And so when you're coming out of hundreds of years of slavery and the trauma that is passed down from generation to generation, I understand that. But what I also understand is that when young people start to believe that they stand on the shoulders of those that came before them, and they walk in their shoes, and they start to get this idea that I come from somewhere. I come from somewhere. I had a 10-year-old girl say to me one time when she heard me talking about or bragging about being the great-great-great-grandson, and she said, raised her hand, Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree, and I found that my great-great-great-great, 4 greats, grandmother was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret, and then she ran away. She eventually became a businesswoman, a successful businesswoman, and a philanthropist. And she looked at me and she said, so do you know what that means? And before I had a chance to answer, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins just like you do. So in honor of Frederick Douglass's bicentennial, his family has published a special bicentennial edition of his narrative. But what we've done with our edition is we wanted to speak to students, speak to young people. And so the introduction was written by a great man by the name of Brian Stevenson, who is the CEO and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, Alabama. And he is a voice around mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex, and he's an attorney by trade. His group works to exonerate people that have been wrongfully convicted on death row and serving life sentences. And Brian wrote a powerful introduction. And what he talked about is what would Frederick Douglass have been up against as a 27-year-old fugitive slave, only 7 years removed from slavery, never spent one day of his life in a classroom, but he writes a classic piece of literature, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, that the Library of Congress named one of the 88 books that shaped America. What would he have been up against looking at this legal institution of slavery? I mean, we face a lot of challenges today, but can you imagine looking at an institution that your government said it's legal to own you and illegal to teach you? Most people would run away from that. But Frederick and the abolitionists and the other great heroes and heroines that came before us looked at this and said, how do we go about dismantling this institution? How do we go about bringing this down? Now, of course, it took a lot of struggle, it took a lot of sacrifice, it took a lot of lives because we had a civil war. But today, we have issues where systemic racism runs in institutions throughout American life. And in the same way that Frederick Douglass, when he started to educate himself and unfit himself to be enslaved, he started to think critically about his condition of oppression and enslavement. Young people that have been reading this book have been starting to think critically about their condition of oppression, and how institutions today conspire to keep poor and oppressed communities down and communities of color down. And we don't want our young people running away from those seemingly insurmountable challenges. We want them to believe and be inspired by the words of Frederick Douglass so that they can look and say, how do we go about dismantling these institutions? How can we use the examples of courage that Frederick Douglass displayed throughout his life? And how can we agitate to affect change in our communities and in our worlds? So what we are going to do with this book is give away 1 million copies to young people everywhere. By the end of the bicentennial year. And that's because history lives in each of us. We all descend from somebody that made a difference. And greatness runs through all of our veins. History lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forward. Because we are the sons and daughters. We are the grandsons and granddaughters. Some of us are the products of slavery. This country is the product of slavery. But this country is also the product of the abolition of slavery. And from Frederick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. And from Martin Luther King Jr., we learned that as free citizens, we have the same rights as all citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by great men like my ancestors were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood flows through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. And we're worried more about our favorite sports team winning a ball game than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. We live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery are hard to hear from where we stand. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from the slaves of today. And if we listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from all of the young people out there that need hope, need inspiration, need to know where they've come from. And when we listen close enough, that's when change will happen. And I'm going to close with a quick story here that I was told that I need to share. And that was, I was born in Washington, D.C., and as I mentioned, spent all of my summers in the summer beach house over in Highland Beach. But as a boy, we used to go on field trips to the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. And I loved going to that home because one of my favorite rooms was the library. How many, by show of hands, have been to the National Historic Site? Well, it's a place everybody, hopefully you'll visit and make it a point during this bicentennial year. But in that library, he has thousands of volumes of books, from the ceiling to the floor. Everywhere you turn and you say, that's how he got his knowledge. Never spent one day of his life in a classroom, but he read everything he could get his hands on. But my favorite room is upstairs and down the hallway, and at the end of the hallway is his bedroom. And you know how when you go into a museum, they always have that velvet rope that blocks off the room so you can't get in and touch anything or sit on the furniture? Well, from the hallway into the room is one of those ropes. And I always wanted to sneak past that rope to see what was in there. But so I would stick my neck over it, and if I looked to my left, I could see Frederick Douglass's bed. And on his bed is his nightshirt. And next to the bed on a chair is his hat. And on the floor is a pair of his shoes. And I was going to make it my mission to try those shoes on. And when we started our work in 2007, we were giving a presentation at the Visitors Center there at the home, and I was talking to a group of students, and I was sharing that story about wanting to get into that room. And the site manager, when we were finished, she said, "Okay, I've got an idea. Let's take a special VIP tour." And so there were about 25 students with me, and we rushed into the house, and I was knocking the kids over to get into the library because I wanted to show them the books. And I was knocking them over to get out and up the stairs and down the hallway. And at the end of the hallway, there's that rope that's been looking at me for 40 plus years. And the site manager did something that they had never done before. And she took down the rope and she said, "Come on in." So all of us rushed into the room, and it's not a very big room. So we were in there almost like sardines, shoulder to shoulder. And then the photographer was ready for the group picture, and he started placing people. And he said, "You go here, you go here, you go here." And he's getting closer to me. And do you know where he put me? Right next to the shoes. And I looked down, like, and I said to myself, there they are. After all of these years, all I would have to do is just slip off my shoes, and I could step right in them, and nobody would ever know. And I'd be sitting there, "Look at me. I'm taking pictures in Frederick Douglass's shoes, finally." But I never did. I know. And I'm going to get up here and tell that story and let you down like that. I never tried them on because I knew they wouldn't fit. Those shoes are too big for any of us to fit into. But what I realized at that moment was that I can take the shoes that I've got. You all could take the shoes that you've got, and we can lead the way to a brighter future. We can lead the way to a better tomorrow. And each and every one of us can make the difference in the lives of those around us. And just like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Cesar Chavez, pick your freedom fighter of choice, we can go on to affect change in the world around us. And thank you, and God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I was remiss in not thanking Professor Dale Green for everything that he has done. My cousin. We just found that out too.
Somebody just say, "Wow." Right, wow, my goodness. That was quite all right. Well, I have the privilege again to recognize so many distinguished guests that we have among us, and elected officials and appointed officials. And so at this time, I'm going to recognize them accordingly. We have from Congressman Harris's office, John Wingrove. We have from Senator Cardin's office, Kimberly Cradaville. From Senator Van Hollen's office, Melissa Kelly. Frederick Douglass Honor Society members. We have President Juliet Bell of the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. We have Liz Fitzsimmons from the Maryland Department of Commerce. We have Michael Haney, the chair of the Maryland Tourism Coalition. Secretary Mark Belton of Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Special Secretary Jimmy Ray from the Governor's Office of Small, Minority, and Women Business Affairs. Senator Addie Eckert. Delegate Johnny Maltz. And we have the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And we have several municipal elected officials, St. Michael's, Town of Easton, and a number of others. I'm going to now call upon Karen Robb, the Chief of Staff of Senator Van Hollen's office, to come to render remarks, and she will be followed by Senator Addie Eckert in that order. Karen Robb.
Senator Van Hollen wanted to thank the county for all of its wonderful work and the dedication of this park and such a monumental site. He is back on the Hill with votes, but he is joining up with the Frederick Douglass family because he and Ken Morris tonight are going to be sworn in as commissioners to the Frederick Douglass Commission. This was passed by an act of Congress, and they're going to be celebrating it. And the purpose of the commission will be to study Frederick Douglass and see how we can apply sort of everything that he did and his wisdom, his work, his struggle going forward. Ken is modest in sort of the work that he does in terms of dealing with really what's tantamount to modern day slavery in his work on combating the trafficking of children. So we're very sort of thrilled to work with him on the criminal justice issues, and we really look forward to working with this commission that's getting launched tonight in honor of the bicentennial of Douglass's birth. So thank you very much for everything that you've done here to really bring him to life. Obviously, in sort of seeing Ken, we know that his life lives on in a very vibrant way. And I just want, on behalf of the Center, to thank you for your sort of turnout today and sort of joining everybody in this wonderful celebration. Thank you.
Senator Addie Eckert will speak on behalf of the Maryland Eastern Shore delegation. Senator Eckert.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. To all of our distinguished family members of the Frederick Augustus, Washington Bailey Douglas family, thank you so much. Thank you for being who you are and giving us this rich legacy in carrying it down as we do talk about hands across the generation, because it is a wonderful day. I just want to say on behalf of the delegation, we are deeply honored to be a part of this. And I have a very short story. It takes a beautiful combination of events and people to make a beautiful quilt, as you all have seen. And I would suggest to you today that today also is a beautiful tapestry. A tapestry through the years that has come together with this moment in this place at this time. God is incredible in what he uses to accomplish his work. In 1994, when I was first elected, I had the privilege of serving with the young West Pointer, African-American Fortune 500 gentleman who said to me, Addie, I went to the Eastern Shore to find my relatives. You know my relatives, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and you're going to have to do better, because what I found was a sign in Lower Dorchester County with a bullet hole in it, and that's not very good. And I couldn't even find the sign for Frederick Douglass, and I called the Talbot County Sheriff, and we went looking. And we found a sign somewhere halfway up a road, and it was covered with vines. And we had to rip off all those vines to find out what it was all about. That was 1995. And look at where we are today. Look at what has happened. God is good, and He's used each one of us to make this quilt, to build this tapestry. There are a lot of hands who've gone into this work today. To the Moore family, thank you. We have resolutions and tributes for you. To the Frederick Douglass family, as I said, we can't thank you enough, and we have resolutions for you. To the Talbot County Council, who years ago destined this property, they didn't think it was, and know it was going to be for Frederick Douglass, but it has happened. Something for you. And to the Office of Tourism, Cassandra, God bless you. To the vision, and without vision, the people perish. God bless you, and have a great day.
Thank you, Senator Eckert. We are now very honored to have among us the second highest ranking official in state government and the 9th Lieutenant Governor of the state of Maryland, the Honorable Lieutenant Governor Boyd K. Rutherford. And as he comes, I'll just share a few brief things with you. We were just in his office the other day, and in his office he has a portrait of Frederick Douglass, which is from the Maryland State Archives. And he also has a book, one of the latest books on Frederick Douglass, that shows the photographs that have been taken of Frederick Douglass, in that he was the most photographed person of the 19th century. Surely Lieutenant Governor Rutherford is a big fan and champion of African American history and culture, and certainly that of Frederick Douglass. This morning we met at the Banneker Douglass Museum, starting off the day, and he is committed to restoring the museum and enhancing the programs there, and we are very grateful for his service on the good part of the state of Maryland. And so it is my privilege to introduce to you Lieutenant Governor Boyd Rutherford.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Green, or Dale as I normally call you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event today, this exciting achievement for the county and for the state of Maryland. You know, it's been a great week thus far in terms of the celebration of the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass, and as part of a great year of celebration here in Maryland. Earlier today, as was just mentioned, I had the opportunity to be there for the wreath laying at the Talbot Courthouse to commemorate the 200th birthday or birth of Mr. Douglass. Yesterday, we held a reception in the State House in Annapolis where we officially declared 2018 as the year of Frederick Douglass in Maryland. I was asked earlier today why a full year. I'm trying to see if the person who asked me that is here. But I was asked that, and I said, you know, one day is not enough for Frederick Douglass, so it's the year. And at the event yesterday in the State House, we also unveiled this wonderful quilt that was handmade by Dr. Gaither. I see you out in the audience. And as you know, it commemorates the time that Frederick Douglass spent here in Talbot County and Anne Arundel County, as well as in Baltimore City. And yesterday, the governor also talked about the fact that we're making plans to honor Frederick Douglass with a statue on the State House grounds, so to make sure that his legacy is cemented permanently in Maryland history and Maryland culture. We also announced, and I know there are folks from Maryland Tourism who are here, the Frederick Douglass Trail to be called Following in His Footsteps, a driving tour, a 130-mile-long trail that will lead visitors to approximately 24 locations that help to shape the legacy of Frederick Douglass and will highlight the character-defining moments in his life. The Following the Footsteps driving tour will take travelers from his birthplace here in Talbot County to his emotional post-emancipation homecoming in Baltimore, as well as to the State House in Annapolis and other sites. And now it's a pleasure to be able to help dedicate and break ground on what will be one of those stops along that trail, the Frederick Douglass Park on the Tuckahoe. Now, this park was made possible by a partnership between the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Secretary Belton is here and was mentioned earlier. Of course, the County Council of Talbot County, and I know there are councilmen, I see Corey here, and there are others here as well, and funds available through our program Open Space for the people around the world to have an opportunity to literally walk in the footsteps of Frederick Douglass and see where his journey began. Now, Talbot County has done a lot already to recognize Frederick Douglass, including erecting the statue on the lawn at the courthouse under the leadership of the Frederick Douglass Honor Society. I want to thank them for the event earlier today, as well as their efforts all along. And with this new park, the Douglass Park, will only enhance and further preserve Frederick Douglass's great legacy and the many contributions that he has made to society. So I want to thank you again for including me in today's dedication. And at this time, I want to present a proclamation that declares 2018 as the year of Frederick Douglass in Maryland. I know the family is back. So the proclamation reads in part, and I don't know what our timing is like. I can go through all the whereases or not go through all the whereases. I'll go through the whereases, make an executive decision. Okay. From the Governor of the State of Maryland, 2018, the year of Frederick Douglass. Whereas 2018 celebrates the bicentennial of the birth of Maryland native Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, later known as Frederick Douglass, and whereas Frederick Douglass was the first African American to gain international prominence for his work advocating for social reform and the abolition of slavery, and whereas Frederick Douglass worked tirelessly to bring social change, meeting with government leaders, penning editorials, making public presentations, and publishing newspapers, and whereas Frederick Douglass further advocated for social change through his autobiographies, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, An American Slave, My Bondage and My Freedom, and the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And whereas the state of Maryland is committed to discovering, documenting, preserving, collecting, and promoting the rich history, culture, and heritage of our African American citizens, and whereas organizations across Maryland will honor the bicentennial of the birth of Frederick Douglass through various educational seminars, celebrations, and events. Now, therefore, I, Lawrence J. Hogan, Governor of the State of Maryland, do hereby proclaim 2018 a year of Frederick Douglass in Maryland, and do commend this observance to all the citizens. Signed this day by Lawrence J. Hogan, Jr., Governor, myself as Lieutenant Governor, and John C. Woven-Smith, Secretary of State. Here, let's step over here.
To the family, who would like to receive this? To the family, Frederick, Augustus, Washington, Bailey, Douglas.
Of George Moore? Is that George Moore?
Nope, this is the family.
Yeah, I know. Don't mean you don't listen though.
Thank you.
And we have one from the House of Douglas from the House of Delegates for the family also. Okay.
All together. Corey, Pat, Jennifer.
Tell me what you need, John.
We got a
Citation
I'll take the
for
Moore. I'll take the Moore
Jennifer
family.
Williams.
The Moores.
And Corey, citation for you all. Thank you so much on behalf of the Senate. Congratulations.
Okay, here you go.
Excellent. Got it.
Oh, here we go.
You got three? Huh? She got three?
She did. She worked that hard. You have no idea how many hours this little woman has put into this. You've slept in 2 weeks.
Where's your party night? I got
I got one good one.
You got a big one. You might as well.